Well, good morning or afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us on this second in a series of webinars to focus on the evolving transportation fuels industry, sponsored by Finboot. My name is Jeffrey Can. I'll be moderating the discussion today. By way of personal introduction, I'm an international author and a professional speaker on energy matters, and this is following a 30-year career as a consultant with Deloitte. First, I'll introduce our panelists. Today, we're joined by Darren Shelton, a maritime industry specialist, a technology entrepreneur. Darren has spent 2 decades in a variety of roles in the shipping services and is presently sales director for Moran Shipping Agencies. I met Darren many years ago at a blockchain oil and gas conference where he served as chair, and I like his bow ties. Darren, anything you want to add to that introduction?
It's closer to 30 years, but I appreciate you making me younger, and thank you for the compliment on the bow ties, and certainly a pleasure to be here with you all today.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Next is Ahmed Raghab, who is the process manager for the Thai Oil Group. And prior to joining Thai Oil Group, Ahmed was with SABIC in Saudi Arabia, where he focused on the circular economy initiatives taking place there, with a focus on polymers and aromatics. And he has a current specialization in aviation fuels, which is important for our conversation today. Anything you'd like to add to that introduction, Ahmed?
I think that's all. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, welcome. And you're calling in from where today?
Now I'm in Thailand, and it's almost 9 p.m. in the evening.
Almost 9 p.m. Well, we are holding you back from evening dinner, so we'll move right along.
I would say it's still too early here in Thailand. 9 p.m. is still too early.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I'm on the west coast of Canada, in British Columbia, where it is just cracking 7 a.m. here. And last but not least let me introduce Juan Miguel Perez, who is the CEO and co-founder of Finboot. Juan's an engineer. He also holds a PhD in physics. Finboot is an enterprise blockchain company that focuses on supply chain transparency, and in particular, very hard to track products such as fuels. I met Juan just at the dawn of the pandemic when I was involved with a blockchain event, and have stayed in touch ever since. Anything you'd like to add, Juan, this morning?
No, Jeffrey, just to say that I'm happy to be here to kind of have a very interesting conversation with some other industry thought leaders, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Brilliant, thank you. So, by way of structure, I'm going to set share a few opening remarks to create a bit of a context, and then we'll proceed to discuss a series of questions. Now, this platform we're using today is called StreamYard. If you have any questions from the audience, of course, just type those into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll respond to them as they come up. And if you wish to address your question to a specific individual, just indicate that in your question. Now, today's webinar, we're going to focus on 3 of the dominant liquid fuels. That's diesel for tractor trailers, heavy engines, front-end haulers, rail applications, aviation fuel, of course, used in the airline industry, and marine fuel. Now, these fuel markets are largely, but not exclusively, focused on the development and adoption of substitute sustain with our existing engine technology, rather than the replacement of the engine itself. Of course, the gasoline market is evolving somewhat differently because the automotive sector at the moment is preoccupied with shifting drivetrains to electric motors with energy provided by battery technology. Of course, some automakers are continuing to invest in hydrogen, but the dominant theme there is battery electric. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to set the whole gasoline sector to one side. Now, to understand why the industry is focusing on creating substitute fuels for diesel, marine that work within our existing supply chains, it's quite useful to appreciate exactly what the existing supply chain looks like. So let me share with you a little graphic that I use in my training courses that illustrate the oil and gas value chain and how it actually works. It's because it is a long and complicated supply chain. Now, the supply chain begins with drilling over here on the left-hand side, right above. This little graphic will reveal many, but unfortunately not all, of the various assets and infrastructure in place to produce and then move fuel to market. I think it's really important to note that 80% of every barrel of oil that is refined in the United States is converted into various transportation and fuels, which include gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and marine bunker. That's according to the Energy Information Administration, a US agency that tracks that sort of thing. Now, the US consumed 19 million barrels per day in 2022, of which 3.8 million barrels per day were diesel fuel, 1.5 million barrels per day of jet, and 7.8 million barrels were gasoline. Now, this graphic brings to light the various factors and considerations that inform how the industry and regulators need to approach this whole challenge of sustainable fuels. So let me just touch on what some of these complications are. So first, the chains, as you've probably noted, they're very long and they're quite complicated. They're also international, since engines themselves have to cross international borders, sovereign airspaces, and marine boundaries, and the fuels therefore need to be completely fungible and uniform in their performance. Each type of asset on that chart, such as a pipeline, a tank, or a vessel, represents a different sub-industry with its own regulations, its own competitors, and its own dynamics. Each arrow represents a custodial change of control, where feedstock or refined fuel changes hands. Now, many of these arrows also represent entire markets, where there is price discovery, purchase and sale, settlement. So you can think of these as places where transactions can take place. And depending on the commercial arrangement, the physical product might not even change hands at these arrows, but simply receives a service, such as gas liquefaction. The tanks at the very end of the chain represent points of final sale. And this is where you see your marine terminals, sales to ships, airports for aviation, cardlock facilities for diesel fuel. There are 19,000 airports in the United States. There are 2 million diesel tractor trailers. There are 200,000 federally registered vessels and several million smaller boats, which are all registered at the state level. So as you can appreciate, no one really attempts to track and trace products through these chains. At best, we have some statistical data about what's happening, but not much more. Now, the diagram has some weaknesses, unfortunately. It doesn't clearly show the segregated nature of the fuel chains. Diesel fuel should never be mistakenly mixed with jet fuel, for example. And this segregation is quite costly. We need separate tanks, separate valves, separate trucks, separate ships. And these serve to minimize this cross-contamination possibility. But the industry still actually has to test all the batches to make absolutely sure that there's been no contamination. And so therefore, what's not shown is this a substantial amount of testing and verification activity that takes place. Every batch is tested to confirm its components to make sure that it is on spec and that it doesn't contain too many or too few of the right components that it needs. Companies, of course, choose to specialize in specific assets or services or geographies or entire industry subsegments, or indeed for the super majors along the entire value chain. But in the main, these chains are highly, highly fragmented. The participants in the chain are at varying levels of sophistication, from super majors like BP, who will optimize every single asset along the chain, including the integration between assets, all the way down to a jobber whose business is limited to moving a refined product from a wholesale operation down to the end consumer. The existing chains, by the way, are plagued by disputes. For example, it's estimated that 9% of all tidal crude sales every day are disputed, representing some 10 million barrels. Example disputes can be everything from late delivery, short volumes, or incorrect specifications. Also not shown, but running alongside the physical value chain, is the financial value chain. The products generally flow in one direction, from feedstock source through refining to the end market. But the finance chain flows in the reverse direction, but it's a lot slower. Trading of products is a separate function from finance. It's estimated that a specific cargo of crude oil can be bought and sold a dozen times before it's ultimately refined. There is an entire sub-segment of the finance industry dedicated to the creation of specialized financial instruments just to optimize all of this trade. And the paper trade is estimated to be 9 to 10 times greater than the actual physical market. The diagram also doesn't speak to taxation, but the fuel industry is very attractive to tax authorities. Demand is very stable relative to economic cycles, and tax rates that are a percentage of the commodity price can often create windfall tax gains. And so taxes and levies can be applied right down to the county level in the United States. Now, quite frankly, the incumbent players, let's be clear, they have huge advantages in sustainable fuels. They own and operate these existing supply chains. They have the systems and all the relationships in place. They've got the regulatory know-how and, most importantly, the expertise to run them safely. Now, lest we think that somehow sustainable fuels can or should sidestep all of this complexity, you need to think again. Governments are not going to give sustainable fuels a free tax ride in the long run. And there is no appetite in the industry to stand up completely separate supply chains for sustainable fuels, given the scale we're talking about. Consider airports alone. They're very limited in their ability to install new tankage, new lines, and trucks for fuel handling. Even marine terminals, which often have a massive scale, may not have the space to allow for a dozen new fuel types. And besides which, we do not have the manufacturing capacity to even build all of the infrastructure required, even if we wanted, for full segregation of all of our supply lines. So these new sustainable fuels, let's be clear, they're expected to work as gracefully as possible within these existing supply chains. And they need to help solve for our climate goals while minimizing their consumption of our other resources. Fortunately, the opportunity to introduce new sustainable fuels to the industry, it also opens up a window to introduce new and better practices that address some of the many shortcomings I've highlighted in the existing supply chains. Innovations can help solve for problems like fraud, tax avoidance, quality assurance, product specification issues, disputes, the provenance of products, and of course, overall optimization. This puzzle, as you can imagine, gives rise to all kinds of important questions for the industry to address. Here's just a few. Feedstock sourcing. The incumbents know all about crude oil, how to explore for it, extract it, refine it. But what about all those other sources of cellulose, used cooking oil, hydrogen? What about all those waste oil products? Where are the skills in these areas? Next is alternative fuel choice. There are a lot of options out there, all playing out. It's not clear which ones appear to have market leadership. So what problems on the horizon do we foresee, given the fact that this industry operates at scale? And of course, product specifications. We have very clear specs for our liquid fuels, and we need them so that they work fungibly everywhere. But there are regular instances where fuel specs are off and they cause a lot of damage to equipment. So are the specs for these sustainable fuels even landed and universally agreed? And what about volume availability? The demand for sustainable aviation fuel alone is well ahead of actual supply. How are we going to close this gap and solve for this? And of course, costs and pricing. Industrial fuel markets are very, very price sensitive. Is there even a market for things like a premium sustainable fuel? And last but not least are digital solutions. How can we use our modern and very clever tools to help these sustainable fuels be successful and address some of these other concerns? Now, there's a nice background, nice backdrop, kind of sets the stage for our panel discussion. And so now what we'll do is we'll turn back to the panel and have a conversation about some of these issues and where and how they play out. Let me begin first with this question about this enormous and broad range of product offers and opportunities that are out there. We are at real risk of getting ahead of ourselves here at stranding investments. How can businesses really scale up fuel production and distribution? There's a lot of challenges here. Darren, let me start with you in the maritime area because the shipping industry is probably one of the slower to adopt change. What do you see as some of the considerations that the maritime industries really has to deal with?
Time historically is a slow adopter, a late adopter in many ways, partially because rolling out innovation in the maritime infrastructure, can be very expensive. I would say first that maritime transport emits fewer emissions per ton mile compared to other modes of transport like trucks or planes. And many people may not realize that 90% of our world's goods move by sea, of which 50% of that cost of movement is in fuel alone. And so for maritime, obviously there's a UN, International Maritime Organization mandate that we go clean and green, and it's certainly moving that direction. But the concerns around which fuel is going to be available when and where at what cost have caused the industry by necessity to move pretty slow, because it's not just, oh, we'll go buy this new fuel. You have to have an engine that can burn that fuel. And so just making one seemingly simple decision has a very high price tag per ship. And then when you apply that at fleets, at scale, it's a massive cost.
Yeah, I think taking a ship out of service to retrofit the engine and its fuel service is a non-trivial activity, and shipyards are pretty busy. I think that's fair to say. Are there any fuels at the moment that appear to have some increasing favor in the industry, or is this still very much a wait and see by the industry?
Well, LNG has been around for a while, and its adoption is increasing because amongst fuels that are available today, LNG is available in most of your larger ports. Biodiesel is available, but the cost of it is very high, and that makes it somewhat cost prohibitive. The other fuels that are discussed, hydrogen, methanol can be available, but you know, it requires a massive spend in order to try and make that work. Hydrogen's not available as a fuel. Ammonia is theoretically available, but practically it's still not an option. And so today, circle it back, LNG and bio are really the only options that are out there.
And these are LNG is at scale. In a sort of a broad industrial sense, but it's not at scale yet in ports.
No, there's still a limited number of ports where a ship could replenish with LNG as a fuel. That's correct.
Now, what about Ahmed? Let's turn to aviation fuel for a second. Do we see the same issues here in aviation, or is aviation somehow different or more advanced? Or are we still seeing these significant challenges around demand?
Actually, I would say it is facing the same challenges as as Darren mentioned here, but more on the aviation fuel, that it will more challenges like how to adopt this inside the producers, because it became more mandatory day after day. But to adopt this in a producer, as a producer, to adopt the strategy to shift to the aviation fuel, this will require a lot of things to be done. First of all, the flexibility of the plant itself, how it will manage to mix between the fossil fuel and the new green fuel. Do we have this flexibility or not? New assets need to be built, as you mentioned before, storage and all of these things, and new technologies, which is still not that much, I would say, very solid, because right now we are working with many research centers and also some universities to qualify some of our like catalysts to adopt the new fuel that we are running with. The other thing is the commitment to the quality itself, because we have been committed to a certain quality of the aviation fuel. And once we will shift to the green one, we still have some doubts about if we can still sustain the same quality or no. So this is one of the biggest challenge that mainly the aviation fuel is facing.
I'm a little surprised to hear that this is still very much a university and research lab study program. I mean, that's not encouraging if you're an airline and you're committing to sustainable fuel, aviation fuel. This is a product that's still in a lab.
No, it's already commercialized, but we are talking about how the existing facilities who are producing the aviation fuel, that they will convert to the green aviation fuel or the sustainable aviation. So they need to do some researches about their catalyst, how they upgrade the reactors or the reformers, something like this. So some of them, yes, still they are in the, I would say, lab scale or the bench scale even. But I think this the rate of the innovation is very, very quick, and I think the most of the companies are working on that. They will come up with more and more solutions in the near future. Yeah. This will not take that much time, I'm sure, with all the pressure on that sector. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging to hear. Let's now, Juan, I know that in your capacity, your Finboot's working with a couple of airlines already. What is your perspective on the entire aviation fuel side? Is the demand's clearly there? How are airlines wrestling with this problem?
Yeah, I think, look, I take the kind of more optimistic view on this, right? Certainly, as you say, the demand is there. There is price concerns, of course, and how that kind of equation turns out. And there is a problem, or there are very difficult supply constraint issues, right? But I think both in maritime, in aviation, and even in land transportation, as Ahmed alluded to, I think innovation is picking up very, very quickly. And we're going to be seeing big changes in the amount of supply or production volumes for sustainable aviation fuels very quickly, right? And part of that, again, it's just looking back 5-10 years, and most of the options that we're discussing here today didn't even exist, right? So now that there's an interest and kind of a motivation from the regulator, from the producers, from the consumers of these fuels, and from the general consumer as well. We're conscious about the fact that the energy transition and this path to a more sustainable transportation it's not only required, it's of interest for everyone. I think we're starting to see those shifts, right? So for airlines, as you mentioned, right, part of the kind of challenge here is transparency, right? And it's understanding of, okay, yes, I have a huge demand for sustainable aviation fuel. I want to consume that. There's a regulatory restriction, particularly in Europe, telling that my volumes of consumption of SAFs have to go up. But because of the price element of SAF, I, as an airline, also have to kind of see, okay, that there's got to be evidence-backed data to substantiate the sustainability credentials, if you will, of that aviation fuel, right? And that's one of the most kind of challenging things, right? You've got global demand for SAF, but supply is only localized in certain kind of more developed areas. That's where the whole book and claim process came from, right? To saying, okay, look, I'll book my SAF somewhere, but I'll claim it in a flight elsewhere, right? The segregation of the production process is not there either. All of that is managed through mass balance. So there's a challenge of traceability there as well. So you need traceability of production, traceability of consumption, and you need a lot of data sharing and transparency for everyone in those ecosystems, right? So I think while the demand is there, the concern for transparency on the industry, it's a significant pain point for the consumers of these fuels.
Yeah, I'd certainly highlight at the global illustration of this. The Global Petroleum Show took place in Calgary a few months ago. The CEO of one of Canada's second largest airline was unable to buy sustainable aviation fuel in Canada, so he had to go down to San Francisco, purchase the fuel to bring it back to Canada to fly around, and he was taxed for the privilege of doing that, on top of the fuel itself being more expensive. So there's some real commercial challenges you point out. This sector is very, very challenging to kind of operate in. Darren, let's go back to the whole maritime side. Juan has raised this important point about the traceability of fuels. To what degree do you see either port operators or shipping companies concerned about the potential that the fuel they're purchasing is not what it's characterized to be? I mean, is this an issue already with existing marine fuels, for example?
Yes. I mean, I remind people that maritime is an industry that still has pirates. And so fraud is very much a concern in the maritime industry. We've got fuels that just get watered down. Then you've got suppliers who may introduce any number of random contaminants to, just simply add more. Can I turn 1,000 tons into 1,500 tons? And it happens all the time. And in many cases, when it happens, the fuel is still on spec. And so there is a certain amount of transparency, but there's not necessarily a lot of accountability. And it is highly common for ship owners who have received bad fuel. They then have a major problem of, how do I get rid of it? It's in my tanks, but I'm now out in the middle of the ocean. And so how is there going to be accountability if I can't resolve what to do with this?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I know with airlines, frequently dumping fuel in the air is how airlines, aircraft deal with things like emergency landings where they're loaded with fuel, fly around and discharge the fuel. But that's a great question. How do you handle that in a maritime context? It's particularly challenging. Let's turn to this question about these technical challenges. We kind of hinted at it already. Ahmed, you had mentioned that one of the technical challenges is that we're sort of studying the catalysts. Can you sketch out for me, if you're an existing petroleum industry refining complex, and you're considering getting into a sustainable aviation fuel, what are some of the technical problems that manufacturers have to deal with?
Most of the technical challenges, I would say, it's as I mentioned, it's from the technology, how to mix with or do we have the flexibility to mix between the fossil fuel and the new green or sustainable fuel to produce the green aviation fuel. So this is mainly about how to mix, how the existing technology can or possess the flexibility to process both of them. But I just want to extend that also to some other areas away from the technical, and maybe it is related, maybe it's crossing the topics. But the other thing is from the economic point of view, and this is very challenging as well, to adopt the new technologies, which still under the research and some of them already commercialized, but to adopt those new technologies, they have very high prices. And this will impact for sure on the prices of the aviation fuel at the end. So as the market is ready to absorb this new high prices, do we have really a good market for this one? Again, from the manufacturing point of view, do we still be able to achieve the same contribution margin or the profit margin that we used to have? Or we will lose some money and this will not be feasible at all. So because there will be a lot of investment which is required to shift to the green aviation fuel. So is it really feasible to shift to this new technology? So this is one of the other challenges. I think one of the challenges, and we have scratched that already, is the supply chain. So I think, again, how to track back how much sustainable I am. So because I'm mixing and then I will give it to a distributor, the distributor will start to mix himself. So there will be many stages where there will be some mixing between the old fuel and the green one. So how to track back and know exactly how much I would say the component of the green fuel. So this is very difficult to track. So I would say this is one of the another challenges that we are facing. This can be considered as technical challenges as well.
Yeah, it is a kind of technical challenge. Today, how is that done? My suspicion is it isn't. Like once the sustainable fuel or once a fuel is sold from the manufacturer to the wholesaler or the distributor of that fuel, it's now the distributor's responsibility to take title and move that product to market. I don't believe the producers carry any responsibility to track the product through the full supply chain. Is that the case?
Yeah, this is completely the fact. But again, after some stages, everything will be mixed, and it will be difficult to track back and claim that I have like 50% green fuel and 50% fossil fuel. This will be difficult to track back. I think if I can drop this question to Juan, he's working. This is the real challenge here. He can answer.
Yeah. Definitely, the chain of custody of sustainable fuels is one of the biggest issues and the biggest challenges, and that's a technical issue for Ahmed, and it's also one that is this kind of prone to fraud, as Darren was mentioning before, right? Because ultimately, again, let's take the example of sustainable aviation fuel. The main feedstock source is used cooking oil. over 80% of the used cooking oil that is used in Europe is imported from outside of Europe. That then risks kind of challenges on the provenance of that raw material, on the fact whether it is actually used cooking oil or if it's virgin vegetable oils that are being sold as used cooking oil. So the provenance of raw materials, already the problem begins there, right? Then you've got, as you say, the producers start mixing that with fossils, which is an excellent way to kind of get sustainable fuels commercialized and ready to use in existing distribution and essentially a vehicle or transportation infrastructure. But traceability becomes again an issue, right? And that chain of custody of, okay, what did I mix? Depending on those proportions, what can I claim as sustainable in the output? And then again, Jeffrey, as you alluded to, there's a distribution element and there's a consumption element, right? There's a lot of models that the industry is adopting there, right? So there is, for certain sustainable fuels, they're taking a segregated approach, right? So it's fuels where the entire value chain is segregated. But as you say, that can play in some cases. It's being used with fuels like HVO, for instance, hydrotreated vegetable oil for land transportation. But that's impossible to scale up to every mode of transportation or every essentially terminal that requires sustainable fuel, right? So when it comes to SAF, when it comes to the sustainable fuels for maritime, what we see here is at the production side, you have a mass balance approach. So it's a chain of custody model where you say, okay, I'm mixing this with fuel, but I'm keeping track and an auditable ledger and record to be able to claim and substantiate the fuel as sustainable with reliable data, right? And then in the consumption, you also have different models, right? So in aviation, we're seeing book and claim becomes more and more established. There's people for and against that book and claim process. There's also a possibility to use mass balance at consumption as well. But yeah, certainly I think, look, in addition to all of those technical and all of those fraud and cost challenges that we've discussed today, the challenge of traceability is as critical because it essentially is what's going to make of this transition a truth and honest kind of a path to decarbonization.
Yeah, it sounds as in the same way we have this sort of physical chains which move the product around to transform it and turn it into fuel. And we have a financial chain, which is paying for it and tracking the costs. We now need to add a third chain, which is the digital chain, which keeps and provides the transparency to the fuels end to end, so that we deal with achieve, if you like, a virtual segregation of the fuel, if not a physical segregation of the fuel. And that's going to have to also be tied into our finance and our commercial chains too. There's a question from Thomas on the online. Maybe we could turn to that. What are the sorts of things that need to happen or be in place, either from an incentive standpoint or a regulatory standpoint, to help move this along a bit more quickly? Darren, let me turn onto the maritime side because I know you're plugged into the various maritime standards organizations. This is not trivial to try and get alignment on fuel across vessels, ports, and the like around the world. Do we have the regulatory environments in place necessary to do this?
Well, we've certainly got a lot of regulatory.
Yeah.
And, you've got at the highest levels, the United Nations International Maritime Organization, so the UNIMO. And then underneath that, you've got class societies and flag states, and then other, quasi-governmental regulatory type bodies as well. So there's plenty of regulation. What there historically hasn't been is incentive, enforcement, or clarity. Now, to the question, what needs to happen right now, the most recent big thing in maritime is the EU ETS, which is where they have added maritime to the EU's emissions trading schemes. And the money that's supposed to come in from that should be used to help subsidize and advance sustainable fuels to reduce emissions in the maritime sector. Time will tell how that works. Beyond that, another incentive of sorts that we are increasingly seeing more of is carbon credits, which have the potential to, give us a little bit of a carrot, a little bit of a stick You've got one that is a market-based measure. You've got another that's creating an entirely new commodity altogether. And in the mix of that, if you're going to have those mechanisms work, you absolutely have to have transparency and accountability. And those two things, the last two, are still very lacking.
So how would this work if these rules just get established in the European context? We've got the biggest shipping companies are all in Asia, frankly, because of all the volume coming out of China. Do those rules then have to apply across continents? And if so, where is there a forum to be able to harmonize those across, say, Asia and European markets?
Yeah, well, fair question. And the short answer is that, all of shipping is international. So companies that are not going in and out of the EU, they're not going to have the burden of the EU ETS.
Of course, yeah.
And so, but at the higher level, what we're seeing with the EU ETS is the first of what will probably be multiple market-based measures regionally. And then the question becomes, is there an international, similar that replaces them? Or do you all of a sudden, are you getting taxed everywhere around the world? And at that point, what does that do to the market itself? Because all of those costs are passed through. At what point do we as consumers say, listen, I can't afford to pay $100 for a can of coffee because the cost has just gotten ridiculous. So they're real concerns.
If I may, Jeffrey, just if you don't mind on regulation, I think, look, while certainly Europe is kind of ahead of the game, if we can say it that way, in terms of putting the most strict regulations. As Darren said, for those that are not coming in and out of Europe, it may not affect them, but there's probably a small group of players that don't do that, or at least not the kind of major global players. And if we reflect on some of the other regulation in other areas that Europe has taken the lead on and the impact that has had, GDPR is a good example of that. GDPR, which is the European regulation on data protection, raised the bar on data protection globally, because ultimately global companies and at least most producers of sustainable fuels do operate at a global scale. In aviation, most consumers of fuel also operate at a global scale. They're not going to have different schemes and different models this is for my European compliance and this is for the rest of the world, right? So ultimately, and I honestly think, it's a good thing that is happening, because it's Europe kind of being the driving force of that decarbonization and road to net zero, and setting the bar higher and higher of what ultimately becomes global standard.
Yeah, this is certainly the view of from other nations, other trading blocs, is that if you can achieve the bar established by the European marketplace, then you will have satisfied the most demanding regulatory framework, and therefore you'll be in good shape globally. Let's turn to this whole question of if you're a consumer of these fuels, like you're an airline, what role and how can you what can you actually do to see that you're integrating these sustainable fuels into your business model? So if you're and Ahmed, I guess I'm addressing this to you really around starting with the aviation side. Can airlines do anything practical and proactive themselves, or are they really just have to deal with what's available at an airport facility, or can they do some things themselves around sustainable fuel sourcing and use?
I think for that one, most of the airline companies, they should also show the interest to switch to the green or sustainable fuel, not only because of the regulations and the formalities that we are facing right now, but also it should came from the companies themselves, that they should participate, I would say, in the research and development of the new aviation fuel. They should put some efforts on that as well. Also, on the other hand, I would say that most of the aviation company, they are not the only cautious or the only care about the quality and the supply chain, how much they will get and at which prices. I have seen many projects has been failed because of the price, because of the producer, as they will switch to the green. So of course, because of the regulation, and also to get the certification, which is very long process. So of course, the prices of the fuel gas, the aviation fuel, it will be doubled, sometimes triple. On that, the aviation or the most of the airlines company, they should show the intensive that they will pay that one. So they will encourage the producer that they can shift. But when I saw that most of the airlines or most of the airline companies, after they will request some green fuel, and once we have some samples and all of this, they will reject because of the price, because they are not able to pay for this one. So this is one of the challenges, and I think most of the airline companies, they should think about how they can go over this obstacle or go over this challenge in the market specifically.
Well, that's a really important point. The price, what you're highlighting is these fuels may be available and there may be a range of them, but if the price is simply too high, there's no market for it. So we have a market failure, if you like. We have a requirement that we decarbonize the fuels, but we have a market that's unwilling to pay for it. This is a message I see in the media frequently, which is a significant concern. Darren, in the maritime sector, this is probably very severe. I can't see how shippers are prepared to pay dramatically higher prices for fuels.
And they're not. I mean,
they're not.
It's just not practical. It's not, pun intended, it's not sustainable to do that. One supplier told me that out of 6.5 million tons of fuel sold last year, only 5,000 tons were for biodiesel. And that just indicates an absence of demand, largely driven around price. And if you're a supplier, you can't produce something that people are not wanting to buy. You know, the cost is just not there. You're not going to have ROI on it. So, so it's, you know, chicken and egg. What comes first? You know, you not have demand because there's not a supplier, or vice versa. But to your point, when the costs are going to be, well, significant, then they're going to go by necessity with what is available, and that's what we're seeing today.
Well, so let's turn to this question of back to this angle of regulatory pressure to drive the change. And I think the one, I know you touched on this earlier, that regulations may be the driver. Do we have sufficient pressure on the industry to embrace these fuels at this stage, or do we still have a ways to go to drive the adoption?
I think the pressure is there. The capacity to produce them at scale is perhaps what we don't have yet, right? So I think that might be the issue. But there's not only regulatory pressure. There is market pressure as well, right? Because I mean, ultimately the objectives on decarbonization and net zero that businesses have set for themselves go beyond what regulation is asking, right? So the pressure is there. What we are seeing, though, is that we are behind on those 2030, 2050 targets. And we're behind because there's not enough production at scale of some of the sustainable fuels that we need. Again, I go back to my original point, which is I am optimistic. I think that the curve and the tendency is heading in the right direction. And going back to Thomas' question from earlier on what is needed, basically what's needed is additional investment, right? So the only way we're going to meet this is through heavy investments in decarbonization and heavy investments in sustainable fuels from every angle, right? And I think for the regulators and for global governments, excellent that we're raising the bar on regulatory mandates. But also what we need from governments is investment in these technologies, right? Because the only way we're going to achieve our targets is by investing significantly in that net zero economy.
Yeah, well, it still sounds like a great deal of chicken and egg, wait and see, action going on here across these various sectors, as opposed to a strong move. There's another question come in from Gethin, and it is: could you touch on how traceability solutions enhance the integrity of certifications and claims of sustainability? One, I'll start with this because I think this relates to what Finboot has been doing with organizations like SABIC and Repsol and others. How does this work?
I'll kind of link it to your comment just before, right? So yes, there's still a lot of wait and see, but you do see some industry leaders taking the forefront, let's say, of this race and implementing transformations or organization-wide transformations that are helping them with that, right? So some of our clients are example of that. Repsol, we've been working with them for a number of years, as you know. Their investments in sustainable aviation fuel, in HVO, in hydrogen are quite significant, right? And those investments don't come only from the kind of infrastructure and production side. They are also investing in the traceability of those processes, right? So the whole element of chain of custody, the certifications, as Gethin alludes to, that go tied to those products. All of that is part of that transformation that this kind of industry leaders are going through, right? So I think I mentioned this before, right? So the only way you can truly prove that a sustainable fuel that's put in the market really is sustainable, really is low on emissions or net zero on emissions, is by tracing the entire supply chain. So digital technologies can help with that. That's precisely what we do here at Finboot. And if anyone's more interested to hear more about that, make sure to reach out to the team.
There's another question from Ryan that I think we should deal with. What are some alternative options for airports, for instance, if they don't have sufficient infrastructure and space to store a sustainable aviation fuel? Ahmed, I think that we'll direct this to you. I mean, how do airlines prepare for this change if this is the situation they're in?
Yeah, this is one of the big issues that facing most of the I would say the airline companies and even the airports. I would say the existing facilities, is it enough, or do we need to extend? Do we need to have an additional I would say assets or storage? So this is again another topic, and it can take a long time because it's a very long story. But what I'm seeing that right now, that the infrastructure is not still that much ready, especially in some countries, for the airports to receiving the I would say sustainable fuel or the aviation fuel. So they still in the phase that they need to decide to extend or even to have an extra storage to be able to supply the new green fuel. The other thing I would say, because it's also very tricky, this transformation will not happen overnight because they need to switch between the old and the new fuel. So this will take very long time. And again, it's about the strategy. If we will need a similar capacity as the existing one, or do we need just to build a small one and then we will switch gradually over time? So this is very tricky, and the strategy is different from country to country. I've seen this many times. But I would say that with the pressure of the regulation, as well as Juan mentioned here, I think most of the airports, they are starting to switch to have a certain storage for the new fuel, and they are getting ready for receiving this one and switch to the new technology.
Yeah, and and of course it's not limited just to tanks, right? You need flow lines, and you've got trucks to handle it, and you need there may very well be staff training as well to deal with.
All the infrastructure, infrastructure. Yeah.
Yep. I don't know if you've ever tried to put a new flow line in at an airport, right? There's a lot of cement, there's a lot of jackhammer. Yeah, it's not trivial. Now that we did one of our questions, thank you very much for that question, Ryan, by the way, that's much appreciated. There's the part of the story framing here is around the circular economy and circular economy thinking. some principles of the circular economy are things like making sure we minimize our waste, we reuse our waste, we recycle where we can. To what degree is circular thinking getting into the way that the industry considers its use of fuels? And Darren, maybe I'll start with you. To where is circular economy and circular thinking coming into the maritime industry, if at all, at this stage?
No, it definitely is. Interestingly, I've got some colleagues that are working on creating biofuels from plastic waste. So you've got countries around the world who have decent systems in place where they can reclaim plastic waste, and they're looking at how do we convert that into fuels. Now, of course, how big is that feedstock going to be? Beyond that, of course, in the maritime industry, you do have groups that do oil reclamation, and to a certain degree, some of that possibly could be recycled to create feedstock in other areas. So I think that the circular economy mindset in maritime is very much there. I would argue that it's equally probably still very nascent, but that doesn't mean that it won't continue to grow, and that's a good thing. And I will circle back to just one other comment that I think is very relevant here. We talked about how a lot of these suppliers, and we'll keep that very broad, and fuel producers don't have down chain visibility. This is, it feeds into a circular economy mindset, because if they can't see their down chain, then they can't see their scope 3, which is necessary for ESG, but it also limits their capability to get into, circular mindsets of, was that molecule exhausted, expended? Was it captured? Can it be reutilized? And to this end, there's still massive opportunity for us to, build out good data. People use the phrase data sharing. I don't think we have a problem around data sharing. We got plenty of data. We got people who don't want to share it. But what we really need is actionable data that can be shared. We need data that people can look at and go, okay, what can we do with that to collaborate around some of these big pictures like circular economy?
Can you provide an example of what you mean by actionable data in the maritime industry that you're missing today, that would kind of frame why this end-to-end transparency would be valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could. I don't know if we have enough time left to get into it too deeply. But, for example, and this is just an easy one, in the biofuel space right now, you've got a lot of potato conversation amongst suppliers who don't have a data dictionary to ensure that they're all talking about the same thing. And so, let's say, oh, this is cooking oil feedstock. Okay, cooking oil from where? What does its molecules look like? So in the biospace, they don't know if their feedstocks are going to be the same blend until they blend it. So, we need actionable data. One of the big areas, and this is cross vertical, is a need for transparency. Transparency drives trust. We have a trust problem. Nobody wants to show their cards. They feel like, oh, I'm going to divulge proprietary secrets. Well, maybe, but we got to have some trust if we're going to move forward.
Yeah, there's a great example there. Thank you so much for that. There's another question online from Sudeep Das. Do airlines have to work mutually with the sustainable aviation fuel producers to upgrade the infrastructure, or is this can they operate independently? Ahmed, maybe this is one you could take, and then I'll ask you to comment on this one.
Yeah, actually, it depends on what we call it, the battery limit. So most of the producer will not be bothered by. They will only think about how to supply until the clients, yeah. And then the client he should worry about his facility. So far, I didn't see any cooperation between the producers and customers. I hope that it can be or it came to the real life. But so far, I didn't see any integration or any cooperation between the producers and the airlines company or the airports. Everybody's singing in his own valley and only bothered with his own business, which is, I think, this is not the right strategy. and to achieve the sustainable or even the zero targets or whatever that has been set in 2030, 2050, 2060. Most of or all the entities should work together to find and to think together and find the alternatives, how that they can, I would say, upgrade all the infrastructure altogether.
One, I think the digital angle here actually is there is room for a mutual collaboration between producers and airlines, because the digital infrastructure is something that they can jointly invest in.
Definitely, yeah. Sorry, and it goes to both Ahmed and Darren's points, right? So it's you definitely need collaboration. We're probably not seeing enough of that out there in the industry.
Yeah.
Part of that lack of collaboration and why everyone's kind of doing their own thing is because of that trust problem. So what digital can bring to the table is a way to, again, share that actionable data, keep control over that data, and make sure that you can have that kind of discretionary power to say, okay, I will only share certain elements with people that I have a trust channel with, but with others, I won't share all of that information. I always retain ownership on my data. I can cut access to that, right? So these are some of the things that with digital innovation you can put in place, right? So certainly, I've seen some examples of collaboration in the industry. More is required, and probably looking into digital and how digital can enable that for them is a good place to start.
That's I think an important kind of takeaway from this conversation today. Well, if I were to summarize, there's a few points that have jumped out for me. One is we are still very early in the game. There is no clear market leaders around out there yet in terms of fuels. So organizations that are thinking that might be definitive about what they might do, it's still early days. The existing infrastructure players, per Ahmed's point, are still hard at work researching precisely how to convert our existing plant to produce these new fuels, the catalysts and the like. And that the missing digital rail, which runs alongside, is something that any company could literally start to invest in, just because it is a no regret investment that would provide them with data, certifications, evidence, which the regulations are all requiring. Let me just sort of do a quick wrap up here and just get some closing comments from each of the panelists. And we'll start, Darren, with you. If you have some closing perspective you'd like to share around maritime, what would that be?
Yeah, I would just make a quick statement to say that, we have to start from somewhere. And that's what we've done. And for some, they say, well, you're not moving fast enough. Well, that's true. Fair enough. But we have to start from somewhere. And the industry has done that. It is doing that. It is moving in the right direction. And I'm confident that we're going to get there. Collaboration is key. And, people refer to like the Gartner hype cycle. You're always going to have somebody that's not moving as fast as somebody else. But together, we will get there.
Terrific. Thank you. Ahmed, maybe closing thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think as all the challenges that we have mentioned all together, it will not. It's not like the negative picture, but I think we should look at this one as a very positive point, because as we identified all of those challenges, that means we can achieve the solution. We should know the solutions for all of these challenges as we identified all of this. The other thing that was time busing, because the people sometimes they feel relaxed because we still have like 5 years to 2030, 25 years to 2050 or something. So by time, once they will feel that we are tight on time, more people will start working hardly to achieve this one. Yeah.
All right, and then last but not least, Juan, closing comments from you.
I'll keep my optimistic thoughts in the front line. I think, look, I see good signals. I think we have started. We're going in the right direction. We need to do more. Collaboration is key. And yeah, I'm hopeful to then catch up with you in a couple of years and see everything that we've kind of advanced in a short period of time.
Well, hopefully in a couple of years' time, I'll have written another book and I'll have more hair. So we have that.
I'm sure at least one of those things is going to happen.
Speaking of books, we would normally have a book raffle for our webinars, but for today, we have been unable to pull all the names into our raffle engine in the background. So we're going to do that offline, and we'll make some announcements on social media about who's won copies of my books associated with the digital transformation in the energy industry. So thank you very much for taking in this webinar. I hope you've taken something away. This path to decarbonization of our transportation sector, it's very much a work in process. So Juan, to your point, we should be holding these sorts of webinars on a fairly regular basis just to stay in touch. If you're looking for more information around circular economy, just hit Finboot's website. There's a number of ebooks there that walk through the current state, and I know the team keeps these publications very current. Keeps you abreast of what's happening. And until we meet again, we'll declare this webinar closed. And thank you all for joining, and thank you very much to the panelists, Juan, Shelton, and Ahmed from dialing in from around the world.